firstly, good to see a lot of new people here. It's always good to see new people, of course. So this is the meeting, the first meeting of 2024 for the operations group, where we'll be looking at what we're going to be doing over the next 12 months. Along with that, we'll be discussing some points on section 38, which George will be introducing shortly. The first thing and the most important thing of this meeting is to introduce our new leaders. For the last couple of years, we've had very sterling work and leadership from Alex Oldman from Civica. But from today, Bex Gibson and Dave Williams will be taking over. So I think what I'm going to do first off is ask Bex and then Dave to give us a quick 2 minutes on themselves. Just 2 minutes, Dave, or I'll mute you. Go, Bex.
So my name's Bex. I work for Live West, which is a housing association down in the southwest of England. I'm currently in the building safety team, and I've got quite a lot of knowledge and expertise in that area. I'm also hugely involved in information management, better information management, and you know this is really close to my heart. So I'm looking forward to being more involved.
Excellent, excellent. Dave.
Oh, I've got to do it shorter than that. So Dave Williams, I'm the program manager for our Building a Safer Future program at Origin Housing, which as of last week became part of Places for People. So so I've been involved leading on various work streams, including obviously BIM, etc. So yeah.
Excellent. So we've got a sterling team to take us forward. So George, do you just want to introduce the section 38 discussion for now? There are a couple of new working groups we're setting up, which I'd like to talk to you about very briefly. We'll do that at the end. So George, if you do that, and then Bex, do you want to take over?
Yeah. Just before I go on to that, I should say that Alex Oldman isn't leaving the group at all. Quite the opposite.
Oh no.
Yeah. So Alex is still very keen. He couldn't make it today, but it's just from a work point of view, he's just got a lot on. They've just been taken over. Civica's just been taken over by Blackstone, I think it is, who are the biggest private equity firm in the world. So be quite interesting to see what there's already been massive changes. Alex is okay out of that, but anyway, just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, so the thing that has been sort of exercising me over the last few months is that a lot of the things that we've been talking about in terms of what information is needed, the fire specialists in our group have said, well, all of that's in regulation 38, so we should be getting it anyway. And I kept hearing over this last year, I kept hearing regulation 38, and therefore I started to dig into it a little bit more. So this is now, I think the key thing is that although regulation 38 has been in place, I think for 20 or so, or almost 20 years, the fact is that there's a lot of information that is supposed to be being handed over that hasn't been. But there's some big changes taking place as a result of the Building Safety Act. And I don't know whether people have fully appreciated the change. A lot of this came in the August amendments to Regulation 38, but this is from the Building Safety Act itself. So an accountable person must keep prescribed information in accordance with prescribed standards and also keep it up to date. So this is now a legal requirement. And it's therefore a legal requirement that you've got to be able to demonstrate that you've been doing that as well. So if you don't have it, you must obtain it, except where it's not practically possible to do so. This is from the Health and Safety Executive presentation that Bex and I attended. It was actually the ASFP, but the HSE were very prominent there. And one of the things that came out of it was not knowing a risk. So in other words, if there's some information missing, you've got to record that into your safety case. And just to reiterate what was in that thing before, you've got to demonstrate what you've done to find it. So just saying that this is a 1960s block, we don't have any O&Ms for them, no longer is acceptable. You know, it might be that it takes you maybe a couple of years to find the information or to create it from scratch, but it's no longer acceptable to not know it. So the secondary legislation that came in August, it actually said that the responsible person needs to confirm that they've got the information that's sufficient for them to understand, operate and maintain the building and its fire safety systems effectively after building works. So this isn't just about new build. This is anything that's gone through any change. And I think this is really significant because in my experience, many years of working with client organizations, they get what they get from the construction team, and really the operations team often don't have the resource or the funding to be able to check it, that it's fit for purpose, and therefore invariably the O&M information is incomplete, and you only find out what's missing when you go and look for it. Now this is a legal requirement that the client organization has got to explicitly state that they've got the information that's needed. The corresponding part of it is that the construction team, in the guise of the principal designer and principal contractor, must make a declaration that they've provided all that information, and also that they've received notice from the responsible person saying that they've received it all. Now, I think that's pretty strong in terms of the process, and therefore, I think from an operations point of view, I think it gives the operations teams, who are invariably not well resourced in the organisation, with some reason to say to their colleagues in development or even in other areas of the organisation that this is something that needs to be collected. So one of the things that we've been doing is going through identifying what are the key assets that are identified in Regulation 38, and these are things principally that I think most of you that know what we've been doing over the last couple of years, we've dug into most of these in significant detail. But Paul McSolly went through with me, and he's identified the other thing that is critical from a building regs point of view, and that's the other elements that aren't necessarily fire related. I mean, some of them are, but these are all safety critical assets. So this is, again, something else that needs to be considered in the safety case. So one of the things that we've been doing is speaking with people, some of the people in this call actually, about if this information is required, who's actually telling the construction teams what it is that they've got to deliver, and who's actually checking it. So I asked several people, oh, sorry. Here we are, right, sorry. I asked several client organisations what they've got in terms of checklists. So this is one from Westminster that they kindly shared, which is quite brief, but it's quite explicit, and it clearly recognises here that they've actually read the new legislation and they know what they've got to do. If we look at the other end of the scale, so that's a single page. This is the one that Origin have kindly shared with us, which is a tremendous piece of work in my view. They've gone through and they've actually checked the requirement and then looked at the documents and information that's going to be needed to satisfy that. Paul's given us, Paul Bray, who's on the call now, he's given us some feedback from what the information that he uses as a guide. And here's another one. I think it's here. Bear with me. Yeah, this is excuse me. This is one from Ealing. So again, it follows the same sort of methodology that the Origin one was, but again, it's asking different questions. Now, we think it would make a lot more sense if we have a common process and a common checklist to be able to work against, so that we've got a degree of consistency. I think it's also going to make it a lot easier for supply chain members, like, you know, Sharon, for example, who's on the call. The information that Sharon may be required to provide would be could be standardized. So anyway, so what we'd like to do is set up a little dedicated working group or work stream to actually explore that and see if we can get something. I'd like to open open it out now for anybody to make any comments or ideas. Paul,
That's your cue, Bex.
As usual, I sat here and decided at the start of the meeting I wasn't going to say anything. But I just, I mean, I think that's really good. And the other thing is yes, I'll happily work out with that checklist that I think, but to get that into the public domain, I think would be absolutely fantastic. Of course, sitting here and bringing into my experience and practical applications, I've just been and looked at some buildings, and I won't say where they are, but they're 4/5 stories because they've got duplexes on the top, so they're probably around about 15 meters. Now, they obviously at the moment miss the HRB register, I would assume. But I've been and looked at them, and I'm very concerned that they may not even have been compliant when they were completed. And of course, I passed this on in a report, but of course, we're then down to there's no money, there's no, we're going to have to hit all the residents with this, that, and the other. And as far as I can see, they haven't got any information whatsoever. And what do we, and they probably, well, it would have been building regulation 16 actually, which was the precursor to building regulation 38, which I think goes back probably even further, that this information was required to be passed over. But the requirement for it to be kept, I think, as everybody's probably fully aware, has been overlooked. But what do we do in that situation? Now, I'm assuming that there's probably lots of housing people on here with blocks, and they're probably putting their whole house in order because they're aware of the HRB requirement. But what do we do when we come across this? Because I mean, I'd love to pass that checklist over, but it will just be laughed at.
Could I just very quickly say that one of the things that I'm coming across quite a lot is this confusion over HRBs. Regulation 38 relates to all buildings.
I absolutely, I understand that, George. The issue that I've got is that I've got these quite old buildings that I don't think were compliant in the first place.
Yeah.
But there's no information. So when I ask things like, what's the fire strategy? Where's the design document? They don't exist.
Yes.
And I mean, and the other point is I mean, it's not my place to go looking further into this, but I haven't, you know, I've made sort of recommendations, you know, if you can find this, but I know it's not going to be there. And as it's not an HRB, what's the driver for anybody to go looking for it? And you know, and I've said the normal things that, you know, if you replace on a like for like basis, you're not changing it. But if you want to change all these actuators, and I think this bit's missing, and this, that, and the other, you're now falling into a redesign. But there's no, what's the driver for them to actually say we need to look at this?
Paul, would you have a view on that? Sorry, Paul Bray.
Well, I was just going to say, first of all, if you haven't got the information, I think the starting point is a measured survey of that building to understand what the building has actually got and how it is compartmentalised.
Paul, sorry to interrupt. That's essentially what I've done, and I've said I don't think this is right. I don't think that's right.
Right.
And you haven't got this.
And then you have to look at how you put that right, and obviously that's where the costs come in. But I think there's a moral obligation, if not a statutory obligation, to ensure that the people that are staying in those buildings, the relevant persons, are safe. So the landlord's got an obligation to put it right, and whether or not they go back under the polluter pays legislation to ensure that that's not been completed correctly is done correctly. I agree with you around the strategy documents. I think back in the day, it was all in paper. You know, when I worked in the fire service, we had filing rooms full of it, and it would be piles and piles of boxes, and you would search through, and you could find the strategy documents. Sometimes going back 20 years or more, we even, you know, found documents going back into the, you know, 50s, 60s. But then everybody wanted to get rid of it. They wanted to clear out their filing cabinets and their filing rooms, and they digitalized it if you were lucky, but they did a lot of file pruning, and it's gone. So you're back to square one. I think the Building Safety Act talks about drawing a line about where you are, but you need to know what that line really means, i.e. with regards to how well is the building structure put together, what holes have developed over time, you know, breaches and compartmentation, how the fire safety measures.
I haven't even looked at that, and I haven't been specific about what I've looked at. But the point is that you know, and I've told them, and I've made the suggestion that you need you know, somebody to look at the design and underwrite it going forward, because I can't suggest anything else.
No, and I think that's the right point. You've got to, the responsibility does ultimately lie with the owner of the building, but then they've got to look at where the due diligence lies that got them to that point. You know, yes. Developers, you know, historically going, you know, out of business, no longer responsible. I think there's a fund now to cover that, because the leaseholders, so the owners with it, if they're dwellings, they're going to be, you know, stuck with this massive bill to put it right, because you can't leave people staying in buildings that are classed as unsafe,
Yeah.
whether they're high rise, medium rise, or low rise. You know, potential for collapsing and any kind of explosion or event is there. So I think, you know, my starting point would be that you've got to start trying to gather the information, what you already know, and take it from there. And I think this is the reason, George, why it's really, really important. The regulation 38 information going forward needs to be there. We need to have it. It's an important element of the Building Safety Act now that, you know, both parties have got to agree that they've got and given the right information. So, I mean, that's a step forward. Coming up with a industry template like you're suggesting, I think would be helpful. Maybe a version of like what PAS 79 for fire risk assessments. You'd have a PAS version for regulation 38 information. That, you know, maybe that's just it. But
so what you're saying, both of the pools, is basically an in-use template. So Reg 38, you know, that's what's for handover of new buildings, which is obviously a lot easier than going back and looking at a 30-year-old building and trying to find out what's important, how to do it, a process for that. So
yeah,
it would be good to perhaps expand on that, about how that would look. But yeah.
Bex, John's got his hand up. John Field.
Sorry, thank you guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. So when I was at Imperial College London, I oversaw several new builds, and it was evident that the responsible people within the construction company weren't possibly over familiar with the documents that were required, or I don't know, maybe they were being sort of obstructive because it meant work, because they had to dig information out. They clearly had to provide this to the local authority, but it did seem that there was this struggle to actually provide me with the required information. So I did do that cut and paste from Regulation 38. This is what I need. This is a rough idea of what's required. Now, obviously, in the Building Safety Act, with regards to the higher risk buildings, we've got like Section 87, 88, 89, which does give a bit more detail as to, you know, you must have this information. You won't get your certificate unless you provide this information, and you must provide it to the principal accountable people, etc. So I feel this adds a belt and braces to hopefully ensure that information is handed over. In the past, it's been buried in a 5 million page document to some extent. So the safety document will come across, and you'd sort of struggle to find it. Whereas again, the government guidance on how it should be provided and what format, etc., makes it a lot clearer. But I think, you know, for this team, this group to work on making this clearer, more succinct, and so the different industries are aware of what is required and how it should be presented, I think that's a fantastic idea. It's very shrewd of you guys to be working at it over the past year, and actually, there you go. This is what we've been working on, everyone. So I think it's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, to flag up, we don't have all the answers yet, John.
No.
What we're trying to do is to clarify it and make it easier for people to understand, and also, as Paul was saying earlier, nobody's got any money, or in many cases, so therefore this needs to be done progressively. Alex has made a comment that whether Alex, do you want to just ask that question about whether the fire strategy is with local authorities?
Sorry, yeah. Hi, I work for predominantly resident management companies, and ultimately everything that we produce is based on the service charges, and ultimately people pay into that fund. And as far as these residents are concerned, they've bought in good faith, and everything should have been signed off and appropriately built as it should have been, and when they bought their property. And now we're asking them to do fire strategy documents, various different surveys. Now, we appreciate things have evolved over time, but there's a lot of people out there that are trying to understand how's the development been built, because surely the fire strategy was in place at the time, and where are those documents? Who signed them off in terms of, this is a development that we want to build. We've asked for planning. The fire brigade have been in. Everybody's done all of their checks, and we've now bought this property and in good faith, and now we're asking them to fund potentially tens of £1,000s worth of surveys that people just don't want to pay for. Why should they pay? And why is it for us? And why are the landlords not going to get involved? And it's a really difficult battle at the moment with these people, and I just don't know if everybody else is experiencing the same thing, really. Thank you.
You're on mute, Bex.
Of course I am. No, that's a really great perspective, Alex. From the other side of the pond, as it were. So I don't know if there is a process for that. This is people don't know about the buildings, and they don't know about the buildings. We need to find that info.
Yeah.
So yeah, interesting. Paul, you've got your hand up. Paul Bray.
Mute. Yeah, come off mute. Take my hand down. Multitasking here. I'm no good at that. Yeah, so in answer to Alex's question, and I think, I hinted at that earlier, when a building's being planned to be built, this is my experience when working with the fire service, you get involved from a fire service point of view at planning stage at limited. When it comes through to the building regulation, at the build time, you get involved in consultation if it comes under the fire safety legislation. And at that stage, you would be presented with the fire strategy documents. Mm-hmm. So the fire service would have copies of the fire strategy documents and all the other supporting documentation that was required for that. And the local authority would have that. They'd have it at the planning stage. They'd also have it at the building, a control body stage. Now, if it's approved inspector, slightly different. But that local authority would have those documents for a set period of time.
Why? Just out of curiosity.
Well, so
nothing's changing.
This is my experience with the local authority in the area that I work, in Plymouth, for example. It's a large-ish local authority, but they probably did very similar things. So they did all the file pruning. And back in about 2000, and I knew the head of building control there at that time and spoke to him about it, they basically got rid of everything that was more than 7 years old. Didn't keep a thing of it, just binned it all. And they may have digital copies, but I'm not sure whether it's to do with the Data Protection Act, because it's not really personal information kept on there. But that file pruning was quite brutal. They got rid of a lot of it. So if you ask a local authority for any background information about a building, they very rarely got it. So the next step that I would have gone, that I went to, I'm dealing with a building safety case at the moment. I'm contracted to do that as part of my private role within the Plymouth area. And I said to the person I'm working for, let's go and speak to the local authority, see if firefighter if they've got anything. And I've got colleagues there, nothing at all anymore. Whereas I said earlier, we used to have boxes of the stuff. I had fire strategy stashed away everywhere in the building that I worked in, because they're useful documents. You never get them again. The level of detail in there, and they've been it. Yeah. And there were people that were getting rid of it because it was gathering dust. Got rid of. And if you may be lucky that you'll come across a digital version. So when we started moving towards the digital mid 2000s, early 2005, was a lot more digital information being passed around. So there might be something stashed away there. You need the reference documents, the original reference numbers to find it. It takes somebody with a forensic brain sometimes to track this down. And that's the problem that you've got. So anything older than 10, 20 years, you're unlikely to find
most of them are 20 years, to be honest, where we're facing these problems, that's for sure.
And I'll go back to the point we talked about with Paul earlier. Even if it is 20 years old and you've got the strategy documents, there's no guarantee the building hasn't been altered a lot since that period. So you still probably need to do a measured survey. They talk about a time period. It might be 5, it might be 10 years. And if you haven't had control over contractors coming into the site in that period of time, and you can't confirm that they followed it to the letter, the CDM regs, they've done their method statements, they've done it in accordance with the construction of phase plan, you've got no guarantee that everything that's been installed meets the requirements and hasn't breached compartmentation or changed an essential system. So that measured survey is probably something you need to do if you haven't got the information. That's your starting point. That's your line in the sand. Go forward and put in a massive control process to stop it from getting worse going forward. So that's what I do. But I think in answer to your question, you'd be lucky if you got it. I would not. I would still make the inquiry, but your local fire authority is probably the one to go to. They may still have it somewhere.
Right. The other problem that we've got is the CDM files, O&M files, whatever the builders have referred them as. Quite a lot of the information is supposedly as built, but it's not always as built, because when you start looking at the plans, things are different, and even though they've got a big stamp to say as built, they're actually not. So that's our experience anyway. So
common. I think I've heard that several times in the past. The designer, the builder, and the owner, there's all three different outcomes. So yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you anyway.
Well, why?
Yeah, I mean, that was really what I was going to say, is that unfortunately, you've had a lot of people, you've got electrical contractors working on fire alarm systems, you've got fire alarm systems people working on smoke control systems, and they're making assumptions that they know what they're doing. Or, I mean, the key one that I quite often see is if you go in and you see a smoke control system, and when the alarm goes, all the vents open, it's probably because, I mean, they're not supposed to do that. They're only supposed to open on the fire floor at the top of the stairs. But what's happened is that somebody's gone in, they're able to get into the system, if it's a fire alarm system, and they thought, oh, God, this can't be right. Surely all the vents should open. And they've changed it, and they've made a design decision that they weren't even aware of, knowing that it was there. And the specific buildings that I'm looking at, that I was talking about, they are 30 odd years old, and I actually had to go back and look at documents from 1971, which might have been relevant at the time of the build, because I wasn't sure that what had been built was right, was wrong. But then I determined that actually some of the fundamentals were what they were then, and now we're getting into one of the things that we're talking about is smoke control systems being inspected annually. That's another cost that you've never have had before, and you've got to budget for that now, because you should be having it done. If you have ventilation systems, the fire dampers should be being inspected every year. If you have ductwork and shafts, they should be being cleaned every year. And the point is that's never been an expense, because nobody's ever done it. And yet now people are going, we should have been doing it, or we should have been inspecting these, or we should have at least done one of these big inspections that you said, maybe when we took over the building as an FM contractor, we should have done this. But actually, because people didn't know, they've not been doing it, and so therefore that's where all these sudden costs are coming from. And then, as we were saying, to determine where you are, I can't afford insurance to do design work, but I go and give an opinion on a building. So what I've said is somebody's got to come round and actually underwrite this design for you, because if they won't do that, then there's probably something wrong with it, and therefore you've got to put it right, and therefore and it snowballs. And residential is one thing. I mean, the worst places I go to, which is probably concerning to everybody, is hospitals. They have absolutely no money, and they've not looked at anything for 20 years. And it's really scary. Whereas hopefully now going ahead, but how we deal with the legacy stock is the difficult bit. I mean, I know George and Richard know that I keep saying this is all brilliant going forward, but legacy stock, where are we with it? And how do, and that was, somebody says, well, how do we risk assess it out? Well, most of the stuff I talk about, risk assessors don't even know it's in the building, and that's wrong as well. So it's if you have risk assessments done, have a look and see whether the smoke control systems are in your risk assessments. They probably aren't. Is there any ventilation there? Is that in your risk assessment? The answer is no, because you don't even get taught it at level 4 risk assessment training. And yet it's the biggest, in the actual case of a fire, potentially it's the one thing that's there to protect people. that nobody looks at. So
Thanks,
I'm
Paul.
sorry
Yeah,
about the costs, but I don't know how to mitigate them.
No, I mean, it's a huge risk and it's a huge piece of work for new builds and existing. So that's kind of why we're starting these conversations. And if we all talk, then we can all come up with ideas to address it. Johnny, sorry, George, Johnny had his hand up.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Yeah, so with some of the existing stuff, so there is no requirement for building didn't meet the regs of what it was built to rectify them. There's no requirement for that. And I also don't see it particularly helpful in going back and trying to find out what a building's regs it was built to, in particularly in residential buildings. I think people sometimes go way too complicated on this. From a risk perspective, in a building, particularly from a fire perspective, you know, it's your fire cause and effect. You know, do you have a fire cause and effect matrix for your systems? If not, get one done, not overly expensive. And then it's about, you know, testing them. So every bit of equipment inside of there, plus fire doors, plus signage, need to be inspected monthly, because that's inside the new fire regs. So, and I appreciate that was a cost that no one ever had, but you don't need a fire engineer to go around and check, is your signage still on the wall? You know, you just need to have a list of what signage is on the wall. And even in a very basic one, you can do that in a paper-based system. I wouldn't do a paper-based. I'd, of course, recommend doing it in some kind of digital system. And even then, the testing of your fire cause and effective matrix, once you actually have it up and operational and done by a fire engineer, and they shouldn't be doing your up-to-date fire cause and effect matrix on old building regs. They should be doing them on best practice. For instance, very simple stuff, the legislation on what used to happen with a lift is now considered wrong and shouldn't be followed. So for instance, a lift shouldn't always default to ground floor, because very simply, if your fire's on the ground floor in the lobby, it's absolutely stupid telling a lift to stop and open up into the active fire smoke areas. So looking at old building regs is in some ways absolutely pointless. You should be doing it on best practice. And then once that's designed, then with clever and just with BIM training, you can actually train relatively simply, you know, most people to be able to do a lot of this, you know, 6 monthly, quarterly and annual testing of the system, because, you know, as you said, it should be flick the button and then check on the 4th floor, does the vent open, does the one on the top floor open, and just go through a sequence of testing. It's all relatively straightforward. So I think sometimes people go, oh, I don't have all the drawings. You don't need the drawings in most buildings, they're not that complicated. I'm talking about residential here because that's what the whole building safety is about. You don't need to have the operation manuals for the AOVs. You don't need to have all the level of detail that people say you need to have, because ultimately it's a physical test that you're doing, and then and the digital aspect should be helping that. I think too many times we get caught up on paper and paperwork and going, oh well, I have paper for something. Having paper on your systems is absolutely pointless, which I have seen, and Paul, you've said the same thing. You flick the switch and something doesn't happen. You know, I've like too often we rely on paper and the digital, but when it comes to the critical systems, a physical test has to happen. Like a good one is, I George probably heard this before, in buildings that we used to manage. I have records going back for 6 years since it was built that the lift operates perfectly every time. And I get in there and they do all the tests and they went, it all works perfect. And I went, I don't believe you. And they went, well, the computer says it's all working. So I went, okay, stick the key in and do the physical test. They stuck the key into the fireman switch, turned it, nothing happened. Take the panel off the back of the wall, it's never been wired up. So it could never have worked, yet the testing and the paperwork all says it works. And this is where, you know, I think we need to be realistic with existing buildings. Just assume all your paperwork it is out of date and doesn't work, and go back and go from first principles. What is it that makes this building safe? What makes building safe is your fire cause and effect operating in the manner it should. and start from best practice principles, test that out, draw it out, map it out, and then build in a new regime of checking it to keep it up to date. I think at times we scare. So Alex, you were talking there about is so costly so much. It doesn't have to be. It's about focusing and the building safety legislation and the building safety cases and reports are built on that proportionality. Do start with what is going to absolutely make your building the most safe for, you know, the quickest, and then build on top of that. If you have money, build on the next layer and build on the next layer, and survey it and scan it and get drones out to fly around it and spend as much money as you want, but start with the basics and get them right. And don't assume your initial information is either right or is of any benefit in an existing building. But
Thanks,
that's my
Johnny.
opinion on it anyway.
No, it's a very good point you raised there with the proportionality comment. I think that's a huge thing that the regulator, obviously, if the building safety regulator makes a reference to. George.
I agree with Johnny, and the purpose of what I'm trying to get to with this is to understand what that baseline best practice is, so that we've got something that isn't just an opinion, it's something that people can work to. Because what I think is also the case, we've obviously got concerns about budgets and money and the like, but the fact is that most organisations are continuously investing in activities that are being carried out on their buildings, but perhaps for different purposes. So it might be that there's work in terms of decarbonisation or remedial works or decent homes or things like that, which are actually being carried out by different departments within the organisation. And if we're smart about this, then the information that they are collecting could actually inform the missing information that we may have from a fire safety perspective. So it's a matter really of ending up with a set of information requirements that everybody can coalesce around.
So for existing buildings that exist, because in the legislation writes out the minimum requirements of the pieces of equipment. So the legislation quotes the other acts, lists some of the information directly, and then quotes the other one. So through the FSO, and they actually get into naming the bits of things that you need to do on your essentially monthly checks. I'm not saying that organizations should be trying to hit the minimum, but if people are trying to get a list together, I think that is a starting point. Take what the government have already written down in the Building Safety Act and linked through to the FSO and the whatever the other one is, the FCO, and they then specify specific items, and that gives you your core list, which is I do have some of that. It's somewhere that I can pull out, but yeah, the legislation does get into these actual things, and I think that should be a minimum. I think that for existing buildings that's somewhat easier. For the new buildings, a lot harder, because it's much more broader. It's saying all the information, and that becomes really hard. But I think for existing buildings, I think there actually is a relatively, I think a fairly clearly defined list.
Johnny, would you be okay joining a brief work stream? We'll probably just have an hour and a half session initially, and then see where we go from there.
Sorry, I didn't realize I'm mute. Yeah, yes, of course, yeah, and I'll try to post into this chat that place when I pull it up from my computer.
Brilliant.
Great, thanks a lot. Paul B.
Take my hand down if I can. Right, here we go. Done that. Oh, right. I understand a lot of the things that you said, Johnny, but there are a couple of bits that I probably would challenge or ask for further clarity, because you tend to emphasize the need to do the check-in and the matrix of checks, whereas I think your starting point is the compartmentation of the building, and that does require a level of surveying. If you don't understand how a fire is going to react in how a building's going to react because of a fire, the safety systems you've got in place are maybe
so
the
from a you're talking about sometimes other buildings, hospitals and stuff. From a residential building, if this is
blocks of flats, I'm
yeah,
talking
so
about blocks of flats.
but that the compartmentation is generally very straightforward on that. As in, there should be each apartment itself should be compartmentated from the next, and each communal area should be compartmentated from the individual residential flat. And then does the compartmentation work? Most likely not. But you know, that is the reality, is that most compartmentation in any building over a few years old has been compromised, if it was even built correctly in the first place. Generally won't be. It's very hard to do full testing on that without doing deconstructive testing in between each flats. The reality is, though, is if all your other, and purely from a risk-based perspective, if all of your other systems work and you control the spread of the smoke, the fire will probably spread, but it's a much lesser degree, you know. So it's all about, that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not saying that it's not important, but on my list of stuff, I would do compartmentation way after I would do my active systems work, because to do full compartmentation, you have to strip. If you're doing the compartmentation between two apartments, very hard to do that without doing deconstructive testing.
Yeah, so I think there's a way forward. You do a sample and you check voids. When you get a void flat, you do things like that. I've had experience of blocks of flats where there's a linked service duct between the whole flats that you could climb in, and there was a 2-hour panel in between.
Yeah, that's in most buildings. I've never found a building where the compartmentation has been as designed. I would ask anybody to buy me a building. I don't believe I'm saying in some buildings it's quite good, but I've never seen a building where I haven't found a compartmentation issue. I guarantee I could walk into any building and find some within minutes, because
I know, but I still think that you need to have an idea about what the level of compartmentation is within that building and what historically has gone on, whether or not expanding foam is being used, and whether it's the appropriate, if expanding foam is used at all. There's a few things that need to be done, and I think it's a simultaneous activity as you get to know what the nature of the building is and what's historically gone on within that building. So I'm not saying I disagree with you. I would challenge some of the processes in understanding a building. I would not just be happy with a building report if it was just based on maybe the active measures. I would still be interested in understanding the consequences of some of the passive measures failing. The piece of legislation you referred to, that I can't remember the name of, I think was the Fire Safety England regulations, which talks about the testing, and it's got the 9 or so provisions that you need to take account of depending on height in a building. So, but you know, I think that's an interesting debate, and we all have our own experiences around how that works in real time, and where we draw the line over it. But I agree also that we're not going to manage to survey the whole building. You sample parts of the building which are strategic to its fire strategy, and where you find fault, you survey further. But you know, that's my viewpoint.
Thanks, Paul. And so yeah, it's interesting. So to feed into this, both active and passive, and then maybe a prioritization tool in terms of funding, you know, working out where, you know, the route to best practice, basically. Jack White.
Hi. So Paul, I think what you're saying there is spot on in many cases, and George, I applaud the looking at the Reg 38 stuff. I do think we need to take things from the operations perspective rather than just looking at what is required in new build and applying that to operations. But I think the path you're going down there is excellent. I just wanted to jump in and, you know, put a point forward about the legislation. You know, the secondary legislation is out there, and I think it's the keeping and provisioning, you know, Schedule 1 of Part 4, you know, says that, I forget off the top of my head exactly, but any document created for the purpose of fire or structural safety must be retained. And then there's obviously a bit of it in the period and stuff, but you can't just say, oh, we're just going to keep it for these little bits and pieces. So I would encourage people to go and look at the secondary legislation. I think there's probably four main bits of secondary legislation that affect the golden thread and kind of BIM as a knock on there. And it says a number of different things, and there aren't shortcuts. It is everything that affects fire and structural safety. If it's created for the purpose of fire and structural safety, you have to keep it. So if something comes up in a report that isn't for the purpose of that, then you don't need to keep it because you're not going to be aware it's there, but otherwise you do.
Thank you, Jack.
Paul.
Yeah, I'd say I would just wanted to sort of clarify the point about going back to regulations that were in place at the time. Now, what I was actually trying to do there was I'm struggling a bit with, if you then start to replace kit, does that constitute refurbishment? And then if it constitutes refurbishment, do you have to bring it up to the latest standards? So I'm looking at this from lots of different points of view. Firstly, the safety of the people in the building, but also any liability that my clients might accidentally take on by making decisions, and also looking at you guys who are running this and not leaving yourselves open in court to something you may or may not have done. And the reason I looked back to what was in place in the building regulations at the time was relevant, because at that point in time, certain bits of kit didn't have tests and they didn't need to be CE marked. But the problem is now is if you then start to replace them, they do need to be tested and CE marked, and therefore that involves you in even more cost. And when you're looking at your point, Johnny, about the lift is perfect, because the same thing goes for smoke control systems. That smoke control systems, although active, are essentially passive. They don't do anything unless they get an alarm. You can go and flick the switches and open and close things as much as you want, but if you don't actually trigger an alarm, you don't know whether it works. So that's a really good point, and that's a point that I often make as well, because I go to sites, they say, well, you can make this open and close, brilliant. Oh, but you can't touch the alarms at the moment because we've got a simultaneous alarm in place at the moment, and we don't want to evacuate the building, and you're stuck. The other point is that with smoke control also has compartmentation issues, and if you've used the wrong products, potentially you're breaching compartmentation, which was allowed before but is not allowed now. And if you're saying follow best practice, what you're saying is you've got to rip everything out and start again, and I don't think that's necessarily correct either. So I think there's a lot of different nuances here, and again, I don't want you guys to leave yourselves at risk by not doing all the stuff that you should do. And just as an example, in the Grenfell Tower inquiry on smoke control, when Barbara Lane was presenting her final report, the actual final report wasn't available to the general public until the day that she gave her final testimony. And I went on there to download it, and just beneath her report was an email from me and an attachment from me that I'd written in 2009 and had been put into the evidence pack. I didn't know anything about it. I don't know how they got it, but the point is now there's a digital record of everything, and all this is sitting there as evidence, which I'm going to say can be used to support your case if it's correct. But of course, the worst case is it can be used against you if you've drawn the wrong conclusions. And there's so little experience with regard to ventilation and smoke control out there that so many things have been done wrongly that it's very difficult to bring them up to date.
Thanks, Paul. And you note quite rightly about competency there, and hopefully the new regulations will address that side of things going forward. For the time being, bring it back to what we need for Reg 38. You also mentioned, just drawing on, replacing items in existing buildings. Now that actually, I'm of the understanding that forms part of the new secondary legislation in terms of applying for building control. So you need to always report something. Category A work is things that affect the active fire safety measures in a building. And generally category B would be passive, but you still need to apply for that building control. So hopefully there'll be oversight and sign off in terms of the fire strategy and all of the associated documents to hopefully bring any replacements in line with what's required to current regulations.
I think
put my hand up.
Yeah, again, that's actually a very interesting point, because that's where do things change from maintenance to a change in product. So this is what I'm saying. I think if you replace like for like, that's okay, but a lot of people will go and replace something with something that's nearly like, but not realize that in doing that they're actually destroying anything that went with the product. But the place where I'm sitting at the moment is there were no requirements for the product when it was installed, but there are now. So what do you declare? When do you declare it? And do you have to declare it? And then if you're changing everything, then you've got to go through the whole design and everything else. And I think that's the area that concerned me, because I just didn't know quite where to go with this. So I've told them that I suggest they get it checked by somebody who, I mean, it's not that I can't design something, it's the fact that I can't do it because of insurance. But so I've said, go and get a reputable designer to check this and underwrite the design. But if they won't, without replacing everything, then you've got to replace everything. And I understand how expensive that is.
Yeah, Paul Bray?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Paul, that you should raise this, because it matters at all levels. It matters at higher rise buildings. It matters at low rise buildings. And I had a couple of occasions in the past, in my previous role with housing provider, where a principal designer or contractor were suggesting that we enhance the building's existing measures by installing automatic opening vents, because that's what the building regulations required for that height of building. They even talked about putting in private hydrants because the distance from the building was more than 18 meters and 45 meters to the whole of the room, etc., etc. Well, I argued against this. It's not that I didn't want the fire safety measures. It was not required at the time of the build. If it was a brand new building, yeah, you would have had that. But it wasn't, and it wasn't a material alteration. It's about the definition of a material alteration in the building. The building was basically the same. The refurb, it was just a refurb. So you need to look at the definition of material alteration to the building. There's a proportion of the cost as well that comes into it. But then it's the letter that I got back from the Fire and Rescue Service that said this is not a material alteration to the building. So therefore, they give a whole spiel about that, and then fire safety order will apply when the building is occupied. But there was no need to do it, and they actually took to put the AOVs in. They were going to put a dry riser in as well. To put this as a 3 or 4 story building, it was ridiculous, and the cost was, use that money in somewhere else. Put a sprinkler system in another building, tens of thousands of pounds. So I was successfully able to get that changed and taken out of the spec, even though it was late in design. So this is why it's always very important to be in discussion with your fire teams at all levels in your housing associations, BECs. That's really, really important at the early stages. But the other part where the improvement does come into play sometimes is perhaps on lifts, firefighting lifts in high-rise buildings, because the older stock will have what's called a fireman's lift. If you're lucky, it might not even be classed as a fireman's lift. So there's about 4 different standards of fireman's lift, or 3: fireman's lift, firefighting lift, firefighter's lift. So, and when you look at the standards for new lifts, if you put a new lift in, You've got to put it into the new standard, but you cannot achieve the new standard in the existing hole that you've got to put the lift in. So you've got to look for deviations, and then you therefore got to talk to the fire service because they want a rescue hatch, they want a ladder, protected water supplies. There's a whole load of stuff that needs to come with it. You're unlikely to get a rescue hatch and a ladder to take you out of the building because the hole's not big enough. So you need to have a variation that needs to be agreed with the fire service because they may not use that lift in the event of a fire, etc. So that conversation is important with regards to lifts in when you're doing that level of upgrade. So I think it's about what's going on in the building, the criteria of the building, but is it a material alteration? Can it be justified, the changes you're going to make? So I mean, those were some of the experiences I had based on your observation.
Yeah, no, so I mean, mine's very specific, really, in the fact that basically you've got an actuator on a standard window that's being used as an AOV, which definitely isn't allowed now. Right. But what they want to do is put a new actuator on, a chain actuator, rather than these magnet releases, which is an absolutely brilliant idea. But then you've got to change the cause and effect in the panel because it's got to drive it open and drive it close. It's a very good idea because these windows are person height and you have to lean out of the window to pull it in. And there are, to the extent that they put gates on them to stop you falling out, and they put holes in the floor with hooks so you can link yourself on, but of course nobody does. So they're all good reasons, but the issue is now because there's standards for these products, are you just able to change the actuator and change the way that the panel functions? And to me, I just don't quite know what to say, because it says logically it seems to be fine, but in actuality, where do you fall foul if somebody calls you bluff on it?
I would call it non-worsening in the first place. That's what I would say. If it's non-worsening,
yes, there is that option. Yes, yeah.
You're not necessarily having to make it better, but you might look at the health and safety issues as well. If there's a potential for fall, then that comes not just into fire. But if you're looking at an AOV, then you also may be looking at control panels at access level for fire services, which then you've got loads of cabling, which wasn't a requirement a while ago. So the costs just seem to escalate for no perceived benefit. That's the bit. I think you need to put that balance in.
I suppose I'm more worried about the head of stair vent missing as well, which is
right.
slightly more.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Thanks a lot, both Pauls. I think just on finally on Paul's note, just to say that would still probably be needed to be an HRB be approved by building control and follow that process. So, which is a new process. Martin.
Yeah, morning all. I won't take much time because I appreciate it's clicking on. So just really to add to Paul's comment and the comment just about not specifically AOVs, but from our perspective, what's not been mentioned thus far from a compliance perspective is we very much see a trigger pointed within the market under the construction product regulations. So the CPR, when we adopted that in 2013, is very much where we do see a lot of sites, as Paul does, as our network of licensed installers do, who survey these sites, and very often that trigger point is if it's pre-2013, they really struggle to upgrade a system to European norms. Actuators on Windows is a classic case. Post 2013, of course, that's a great trigger because they can say it should have complied at that point because we adopted a European norm. So really just to add to the conversation, the CPR from our perspective is something that really does influence the decision on what you can recommend, what you can't, as opposed to upgrading it to how it was initially installed. And the CPR adds to that conversation. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, Martin, what I'm talking about is even pre-2003. So I really was stuck on the standard. So yes.
Thanks, Martin. George.
Yeah, it's a quick question. Am I right that one of the starting points for a building, let's say, for example, you don't have very good quality information, but am I right to say that all buildings need a fire strategy plan?
I think so, yes.
No.
Oh.
No.
You mean legally or should do?
Legally.
Well, it will need an evacuation strategy, so stay put in place, but a fire strategy, as in more past that, I don't think, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think legally any of the legislation says that in an existing building, I'm not talking about the handover new, but I think you would find it very hard if it's a residential HRB to have any type of a safety case without some form of a fire strategy in your building, because how else are you managing the strategy around your fire? So yeah, but legally I don't think, outside of those buildings, I don't think there is, but I could be wrong because I'm not I don't know all, like
Yeah,
everyone don't know all the legislation.
I think you're right in everything you're in there, Johnny. Yeah.
I think that I think everything generally does, because I mean I've even seen sort of like 2-story office blocks and all the ADB information and the fire strategy, in inverted commas, if you want to put it, is all on those drawings. So it may not be a separate document, but it could easily be just included down the margins of a bigger AO drawing of the floor, because you need to know where the compartment walls are. You've got to show that your stairwells are compartmented, etc., etc. So you can't really build a building without that information, or I mean, if you do, you're taking a big risk.
But when I've been shown a fire, I was with a fire engineer recently, and when he was talking with the client, he said, I need the fire strategy plan, and they said, well, we've given you them, and what they were actually talking about was the fire evacuation plan. So they were showing the drawings and the compartmentation, but he showed us a fire strategy plan, and it was about 50 pages, where it was a full fire strategy plan, and he was differentiating between the two.
There's no obligation to have one for an existing building, George.
Right.
Oh, sorry, for an existing building, no, but you can't construct without it, and I don't think you've been able to construct without it for some considerable time. But if it's got lost, there's no requirement that you have to have a new one.
But you'd have to declare in your safety case that
you didn't have one.
You don't have one.
I would think so.
I think what Johnny's saying is that it would be odd for you not to have one. I think that's what you said, is it, Johnny?
So if no, it's not odd to have, like, lots of buildings will not have any at all. So I think just be clear on what the different documents and where they are. So inside, what I'm saying is, if you have a building safety case, so it's a HRB, you have to do, 7 stories, have to have a building residential, have to have a safety case. It would be very hard to write a safety case without having some form of a fire strategy document. A fire strategy document, if it's a fire strategy document, if you have the original one from a building, from the design, that should be used and checked to see is it up to date. If you don't, you would get a new one produced. The level of detail of a one for an existing building, say a 20-year-old building that you would get produced where you've lost it or whatever, would be very different level of detail than one that you get done in a new build, as you said, which would be 50-page document, is quoting all the relevant legislation, is getting into all detail which is needed to design and operate the building. But ultimately, if you're doing one for an existing building where you've lost one and you want to get a new one created, you would be doing it differently, because you'd be looking at just the stuff that you can know about a building and the strategy, and essentially, and a lot of that then gets based, as we said, on your fire cause and effect. So what are you doing to your active and your passive systems, and what do you know? So for instance, your fire strategy in a building where you don't know the information, you don't know the compartmentation, would be good. You could be, we have a low level of trust in our fire compartmentation, and therefore we are going to go to a phased evacuation strategy, and that is going to be run by the evac system, linked to the fire alarm, linked to blah blah blah, and somebody would write all of that up. And that would, but doing that on an existing building is definitely doing it different to doing it on a new building. As I said, it's not a requirement, but I think the regulator would look and go, well, you've given me you've given me a a safety case, yet you have no strategy, so I think straight away, like, like they're not idiots. They're going to look at stuff and go, you've given me a safety case, do you have a bit safety management system, a strategy, a fire strategy, a structural strategy, evacuation strategy? I think, like, at a minimum, if they looked at that and you said, oh, we don't have any of that, but we still have our buildings are safe, I think they'd probably laugh at you.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're the type of people to laugh, or the type of people just to try to tell you to I don't know, hit you with their stick or whatever. They throw some, you know what I mean. So I think it's, but the question of is it legal? I don't think there is a legal requirement to have one. I think Jack and John and someone else were said the same. So.
Thanks, Johnny. I think on that, it's just determining that, the fire strategy is a document that justifies the decisions on why the systems in that building are appropriate. And I'm just on that note, just before we go over to John, I just wanted to mention as well the requirements in the fire in the secure information boxes. We've got to provide drawings of key fire safety systems for the fire service, and ultimately that can be one all in the fire. Like, we've had retrospective fire strategies done for all of our HRBs, just so we can bottom this out, so we're telling the fire services the right thing when they're there. So they're all very much interlinked, really. John.
Sorry, yes, thank you. From experience, in general, the fire strategy, the plans, the design of the building should be in regard to the fire strategy. So it might be that the designer will design something, then it goes to the fire engineer, and they have a look at the concept, and it might be, well, travel distances are too far, or you need compartmentation here because you've got to separate two separate means of escape from an upper level, etc. So then you have to start putting in compartmentation and doors and so on. This will normally be about stage 4 at the design stage. What then should happen is when it's occupied at stage 6, for example, you then get another fire strategy written, because as we've discussed, what's actually designed isn't always sort of as built and what's completed. HRBs, obviously it's slightly different. When there's changes to the plans as you go along, in essence, all the documents should be updated, and the building safety regulator should be notified, so they can make sure actually what the paperwork you've got at the end, when people are just about to go in, actually matches what it looks like in real terms.
Thanks, John. Paul.
Yeah, hi. Probably just going to reiterate a few things that have been said, but the fire strategy can be quite a simple document because it depends on the size of the building, but it should also include the codes of practice that it's being built to. So your fire strategy be based on approved document B, it might be 9999, might be 99991, or the fire engineering one. So you need to base it on that. But so you could design a fire strategy for an existing building based on what's already there, because you're going to be looking at what's the fire action? Is it simultaneous? Is it stay put? What's the travel distances? What are your means of escape protected? What means for raising the fire alarm? So that's all part of that. And how do you maintain that? For a newer build or for a major refurb, the fire strategy document is quite important, because I've had in the past the fire strategy document been presented. You're looking at that, and during the build or the refurbishment stage, something wanted to get changed. It might be the standard of fire alarm or whatever it may be. That's the time when you refer back to the fire strategy document. What does that say? And you have to make it a formal change to the fire strategy document. You can't just make a change on site. And we talked about this earlier, where you got the designer, the builder, and then the end user. It's 3 different types of building because it's not come out as it should be. But maybe that's part of it not following the fire strategy document as well. That's key, because to a certain extent, that is your underlying or your foundation to the rest of the building, that fire strategy document. So there are times when I think it's a key and very important document, especially on the more complicated buildings. On the smaller, simpler buildings, it's I don't think it's been covered in the plans, or it's but there's a nod to that fire strategy being put in within the document. And sometimes maybe this building has been built in accordance with this code of practice, and it'll just outline what that might be. But yeah, I think, you know, there's probably several different answers.
Thanks, Paul. I think you know, it's very clear this is a bigger beast than just simply talking about Reg 38. But let's bring it just back to what we started this session just talking about, and how I mean, let George know if you want to be involved in the work stream in particular, and if there's anything else that anyone's got experience of with Reg 38, you know, of handover or operation. How are people dealing with existing buildings? Like I say, for us at Live West, we're doing retrospective fire strategies. We are carrying out compartmentation surveys. We are doing all of those things to make sure ultimately the buildings are safe. And that's kind of my bottom line in everything. If it's the right thing to do, we generally do it. But yeah, please let us know if you have any more comments. Radio silence. We've got a few messages in the chat. Matthew Rainsford, you mentioned about your level of details 1 to 3 pages instead of 50. Again, I think it's a proportionate thing in the use, isn't it? It's how is the document being used, and what the building is. Do you want to?
Yeah, totally. I agreed. I think with Jonathan had mentioned it already, so I didn't want to dwell on it, and I just left it in the chat. But yeah, we've got 1 to 3 pages on buildings that are 50 years old. We've got 50 pages for a new build. So I think it always comes down to this proportionality. It's really difficult not to spend money, but I think, you know, you've got to be very targeted in what you spend. And I still think there's a lot to learn about what is it that the regulator's looking for. Otherwise, we could produce lots and lots of information, and it's trying to make sure that that information is useful to someone somewhere. Anyway, that's it for me. Thanks, Bex.
Thank you. And I think Chris makes a good point in the chat as well about data. So let's bring it back to the, you know, the golden thread. You know, the reason why we're all involved in this sort of thing is good data. It creates good results. Bad data, exactly the opposite. So yeah, I think focusing on what elements are important, which are priorities, and how best to incorporate those into kind
Bex,
of a data.
Bex, it's Matthew Rainsford here again, and
Yes.
whilst you mentioned data,
yes.
This is something that really I struggle with. Is I'm going down the route of capturing the location of every single smoke, heat, sprinkler, so that I know I'll have 3 sprinklers or 3 smoke detectors in a communal corridor on the first floor. I don't know about anybody else, but are they taking it to that level of granularity where I will know that at building X I've got 57 and I'll know exactly where they are? I sometimes work out, am I going too deep or am I not? Go on, John, you got a question up.
Go on.
Yeah, so again, from a personal perspective, it was essential to be able to budget each year for a period of time at Imperial, and without knowing pretty much to the point how many detectors you had, i.e. how many you might have to replace after the lifespan of that actual product, it becomes hard not to be able to budget. You've got to make sure that each one does get tested. The engineer that comes in to test them knows where they are. On your as wired drawings for fire alarms, it should all be denoted on there. The systems we used, DRAC system, which was a visual display, it would indicate each head and identify which head was going off. So in essence, it is important to have it down to that granular level, most definitely.
Thanks, John. Paul.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with that, because if you're looking at things like fire dampers, you can't see them, and in worse instances, somebody's put them above a solid ceiling that somebody's put in because it looked nice, and you've got to give access to it. So yes, you've got to find everything and know where it is.
Thanks, Paul. George.
Yeah, I was just going to say that from an asset management point of view, just picking up on things, it's not so much what the regulator needs, although that's clearly important. It's also important from an operational perspective to make sure that you know what assets you've got and whether they've been inspected. And in many cases, asset management systems are really managing the activity of doing an inspection rather than recording it against the individual assets that have been inspected, which may sound odd, but it's that's why what you're doing, Matthew, I would say is the right way, because from an operational point of view, how else do you know whether that particular fire damper has actually been inspected?
Sorry,
Yeah,
Max,
we're
can I
working
just
with our.
interrupt? Can I just interrupt? Chris Milling, who you mentioned just now, she's actually a data specialist. So while we're talking about the data, would it be an idea to actually have a data specialist going to, she says in her comment, what data you need and put it in a suitable place? And we're all talking about data management. Chris, are you there?
I am. Yeah.
Good to see you again as well.
I made it for one. Oh, yeah.
You did. Well done.
Yeah, no, it's just listening to the comments. Where you've had lots of information, it's got thrown away. You've talked about, you listed at the beginning, George, all your fire critical elements, as well as the requirements. So anything, yeah, I've worked in automotive as well. So they had a safety critical systems where they knew what all those elements were. So it might be that if those are the things you've got to capture, you might not have a system yet, but if things change constantly in a building, what are those fire or those critical systems? Which elements, like the bolts, might you need to just check or get eyes on, as Johnny said, so that perhaps if things are swapped out, that you know what's been put in. As you say, if it hasn't been swapped out with like for like, what's new's come in. But creating all the information all the time, then you're just you've got all the paper, you don't know where to look. It doesn't necessarily help people, but it's how you identify the things you need to keep track of, so that if there is an inspection of that item, you can say, I've checked it. It's recorded once, but then when you need to generate the information on this date, this is the situation. And I don't, yeah, it's not an easy task, but again, if you've got all the pieces of information, that's not easy to try and draw those together, where those pieces of information could be created at any point in time, and it doesn't give you the current situation either. There you are. Sorry to throw that in.
No, thanks, Chris. And I think that feeds into kind of what we're aiming to do here is, it's an education piece for all of us. It's a sharing of information, sharing of knowledge, and to feed into ultimately an information requirements piece that we all know what we're asking for. We all know what we're tracking. We all know how we go about it. So that's a really great point. George, am I on the right lines with all of that?
Definitely, I think so. I mean, if we can get out of this particular group just an action for us to have a little bit of a deep dive on it, I think that would be really beneficial. I think we've had a good session today.
Great, thank you all. Has anyone? We have a grand total of 4 minutes remaining. So please, if there's anything else that you want to bring up in terms of this, or anything else related to the group.
I've got one other thing. If nobody else has got anything, I don't want to dominate it, but I've got one other thing. It's just that the design group has been going through looking at their responsibilities for the Building Safety Act and identifying, interpreting things from that, and they'd like to get they'd like to share that with the other groups. So if I just show you what they've done. They've also done a Miro board as well, which we'd like you to contribute to. But this is basically their interpretation of the key elements from their perspective, and going through looking at what they've got to do for each of the gateways and the like. So they've called this a crib sheet that they can then use and build on. This was that was an interesting one, because there's quite a lot of talk about what the cutoff points are and things like that. So if I could share this with people, and then you can perhaps contribute your knowledge. We don't have the answers. This is just a collective approach. So if you could maybe just scan your eyes over it and come back with some, just comment on this or something like that.
Thank you, George. Yes, linking in with the other groups, always good, always a benefit. I don't have anything more to add in the next 2 minutes, so it's been a pleasure to talk with you all today.
Thank you, Bex. Great job. Well done.
Cheers.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.